Hello there, and welcome to episode 4 of the IG Lighthouse podcast with me, your regular host, Scott Sammons. Now, if you've made it this far in the podcast, you're doing well. Lovely. And as you know by now, we have one with me and then one with a guest. So our next episode will be looking at imposter syndrome and mental health in our profession with an honoured guest. Details to come out soon. However, this week we're going to be looking at, or I'm going to be looking at, the data part of data protection. So I want to explore this a bit more because this has been coming up more and more and more. And some of this is very much my opinion. And some of it is very much stuff that's cropped up with other people in some form or another. And there are a number of professionals out there that have some good stuff that's worth you having a look at that I'm going to signpost you to as well. However, I think it's fair to say, and I'll be very interested in your opinions on this, so do feel free to comment, feedback, etc., that as a data protection professional, especially those of us that have been doing it for 20 plus years, so under the old Act, as well as the new fun GDPR stuff, it would be fair to say that we've kind of spent a lot of our time and we are most comfortable operating in the information and records space. And by that, what I mean is structured records, structured systems, things you could point to as that's an employee file, that's a customer complaint file, that's this, that's the other, that's all the rest of it. That sort of structured, defined things. We haven't really played in the data space. And by that, what I mean is actual bits of data, value of data, quality of data, meaning of data, using one value versus another type versus another, how it can be managed as a science, as a standard, that sort of thing. We've kind of not really outside of certain professions. So I fully accept there are a number of professions where if you're a data protection officer, that's your bread and butter. So this is very much a broad spectrum statement. But in my experience, working with a number of DPOs and attending network events, and blah, 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 it's predominantly been in that sort of space. Now, that means, therefore, that when it comes to the modern world, so if you look at things like things that go down the route of predictive analytics, performance analysis, genuine data, there are a number of us that are going to struggle with that or need to start upskilling. And by that, what I mean is, so right now, in terms of where the profession is going, standards, industries, for example, if someone came to you and said, I'm looking at running a proposal for, doing performance studies on the effectiveness of teachers and or teaching methods. So looking at the effect of different teachers, different teaching styles on student attainments, student outcomes, overall school performance, etc. Or a predictive algorithm for determining individual care needs and the factors that can affect care, the ability to pay for care, care settings, home, etc. Or a new financial model for determining suitability for a particular financial product, likelihood to repay, or marketing analysis to determine purchasing probability and likelihood to respond to particular products and services. If I was to picture any one of those to you and go through the individual data fields that we're looking to be using, even if you can get past the legal principle one, lawfulness stuff, which are legitimate concerns, but that's where most people tend to stop or focus, If we actually then got into the nuts and bolts of what data is going to be used, the value it's going to be put on it. Because remember, these sorts of algorithms and data manipulation places value on individual items of data, whether it's minimal value, defining value. Would you be able to, as a DPO, would you be able to scrutinise that and say, for example, is it appropriate, coming back to the question about Principle 1, is it appropriate to hinge a score on someone's performance with regards to teaching or teaching method? Is it appropriate to do it on data that's either out of date or on schools that are very different to the one this is currently being done on, or even on factors that don't take into account student ability, disabilities, other things? A lot of the time, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm very interested in opinions on this. Most of it, when we come at it without formal data training on the value of data, where it's derived from, how valuable different data sets can be for different reasons, most people just follow it logically. Logically, is it appropriate, or no, let me rephrase that question. Logically, if I was to say to you, we're going to look at the performance of different teaching methods and not take into account individual learning needs, demographic of the student makeup, whether they have particular learning styles, particular learning disabilities, logically you would say that's going to be a flawed model. But even that sense of logic is based on, well, if you've never worked with a school before, you'd never know that. Or if you'd never worked with a finance product, you'd never know that. Or if you'd never worked with marketing before, you'd never know that if it was a marketing algorithm. So a lot of it is based on what I would label as, I don't like using the word common sense, but it's that common knowledge stuff, situational knowledge stuff. It's not based on actual knowledge of data in its true sense. It's based on operational knowledge of products, contexts, that sort of stuff. On that basis, therefore, it has been, and I've seen a lot of this, but again, this is not true for all, so this is a percentage of, it's subjective, open to interpretation, or we could misunderstand things or miss things that crop up. All these sorts of models need data to work, and all of them have different data sources, different values, different ethical considerations. So another example, for example, would be postcode, as an example. Often it's used quite a lot in a number of different things, but depending on how it's being used and the data it's being associated with, it can actually be quite unethical. So, for example, a real life example, I think it's widely attributed that the reason why the 2020 GCSE scoring algorithm went so awry was because of a major part of it being to do with postcode, in that too much value was put on historical achievement but assigned against postcode. So if, for example, 5 people under a particular postcode got an average score of a C, and now little Johnny this year is predicting to get an A, that would bring his overall score down. Similarly, if the average score was A and someone's predicted a D, it would bump it up. Is it really fair or ethical to associate or to put a lot of causation value, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, on postcode? It brings all the historical positives and negatives with it. Is that an appropriate thing to do? Ask yourself the question, as a data protection professional in the 21st century, have you considered individual data elements and the history of, the ethical uses of, all the context that come with it? As an example of this, I highly recommend reading any of the material from Cathy O'Neill, specifically the book Weapons of Math Destruction. It's very, very good for giving you lots of different examples, very American examples, but not always. There are some UK examples in there as well, of individual data elements and the power they have, what they're used for, how various data analysts legitimate or other, have used those individual elements to draw wide conclusions from people, put them into buckets, to use a phrase, which then has quite profound effects on people in some form or another. So, going back to that question just now, as a modern data protection professional, have you considered, looked at, trained, whatever word you want to use, data in its purest sense? Not just processes, not just systems, data, especially as more and more and more systems are going algorithm-based, data science-based, AI-based. There's a particularly good website that I highly recommend if you've not seen it before. And I'll plop a link to it in the blog post that will accompany this episode, called Spurious Correlations, because correlation is not causation. With the GCSE stuff and the postcode, there was a belief that because postcode correlates with academic attainment, there is a trend. There is a trend. There is a correlation there. That is true. But does it mean that just because you live in AB1, for example, you are determined to get X or Y or Z grade? No, that's not an absolute. That's not a causation. It's a factor. But how much weight we place on that factor depends greatly on a number of different elements. So there's a really good website called Spurious Correlations that gets updated quite regularly. That gives you examples of stupid correlations. Like right now, for example, the first one on the example that they've given on their website is the number of movies Elijah Wood appeared in correlates with the number of orderlies in Oklahoma. Or the distance between Uranus and the Sun correlates with the global count of operational nuclear power plants. Or associate degrees awarded in engineering technologies correlates with Google searches for daylight saving time. Who knew? Or the popularity of the first name Camden correlates with UFO sightings in Florida. Both of them spiked quite heavily in 2015. But what has UFO sightings got to do with the first name Camden? Or kerosene used in El Salvador correlates with Google searches for attacked by a squirrel. They took a massive dip in 2007 for some known reason. Have a look at the examples. It's a really good example of how when you're challenging or when you get a DPA or something like that, where someone's saying we're going to build these are the factors we're going to build an algorithm on. These are the elements we look at. This is the value that we put on certain things. These are things we need to challenge as a data protection officer, because especially if they're being used to make decisions about people, especially if they're being used to make automated decision-making, profiling, putting people into boxes that affect them in some form or another, then if that algorithm is being built on, or too much value is being placed on something that in life that has no causation between one thing and another, so postcode and academic attainment, correlation yes, causation no, then is it really appropriate to hardwire that into an algorithm? So what's the phrase that I think is Henry Ford that's associated with the phrase rubbish in, rubbish out? Well, as a DPO, if you've not got experience or training or working knowledge of data quality, data science in its purest term, how are you meant to know what is rubbish? Because a data scientist, if you ask them what's relevant to working at academic attainment, where someone lives is a legitimate factor. It is. But does that mean that this little clever algorithm should place that as a key value point that has a massive effect on the end outcome? No, they're not the same thing. It's almost, if you think of the principles of data protection, principle 3, data minimization, principle 4, data quality, they are designed to work in harmony, but there are lots of quite legitimate situations where they actually brush up against one another. And again, as a DPO, there's no expectation for you to be an expert in data science, but to know the basics of, to know when someone is pulling a fast one or making wild conclusions of individual data fields that to the outside world seem perfectly logical, but the moment you actually pull them up to scrutiny, they're not logical at all. So I kind of suppose it kind of poses two questions. One, is that actually the role of a DPO to know that and be able to challenge that? Or is it actually the role of someone else, data governance, for example, genuine data scientists, rather than some people that work with data that haven't got a clue how to do it scientifically? Is it actually their role? And we then just ally with them, rely on them. They advise us and we advise them. Don't know. I'm not actually sold one way or the other on that. However, what I do firmly believe, and this is something that's cropping up more and more and more, is that just like we needed to understand marketing and how it works, just like we need to understand 365 and how it works, or any other types of technology, having a good understanding of the engineering of data or the basic operations of data, I think can only be a good thing in your skills and portfolio. Or even just, what are your maths skills like? I mean, don't get me wrong, there's no expectation for you to be a maths genius to be a DPO. However, because a lot of these models, AI models, large language models, predictive analytics models, whatever, are essentially equations, mathematical values. Having a sound mathematical set of skills, I think, leading into the previous point about understanding data, would help, definitely. Is it necessary? No. And to be clear, I'm not saying that it is. But is it something that would definitely help you? Yeah, definitely. As a starting point, I recommend, well, apart from Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, I also recommend two other books. So if you want to get more involved in the data management, data governance, data ethics stuff, there are a number of courses you can go out there and you can become a certified data ethicist and all that other good stuff. Yes, do have a look at that. But also, reading-wise, I would recommend two books. Ethical Data and Information Management by Catherine O'Keefe and Dara O'Brien, and their second follow-up book, Data Ethics, Practical Strategies for Implementing Ethical Information Management and Governance. They're written by two professionals who, they're very good, two professionals who for many years I thought were data governance people who did data protection, rightly or wrongly. However, the more I get involved in these sorts of projects and the more after reading their books and getting involved with some of the stuff they do, actually, I think that they're ahead of their time. They are where the profession is going to go, in my opinion, and they are well equipped to understand how our future personal data and all the issues of which are genuinely going to be more of the data bit of data protection, and the areas that we've kind of played in as traditional DPOs for a number of years, especially in the public sector, are going to change. It's going to become more data-driven, more data involved, and we are going to be involved in more and more and more of these sorts of data-based technologies, algorithms, outputs, etc. Rightly or wrongly, I think that's where it's going to go. So a bit of tips for your own development, therefore. Have a look at those three books. They are very, very good. And just be mindful. Have a look out over the next couple of weeks or so, just when you're looking at advice, when people come to you, just what you deal with over the next coming weeks. Just look at it and look how many times data crops up, how it becomes more and more and more of a part of your role, and ask yourself, what are you advising on? What is it people are asking of you? What skills are you calling upon to answer them, to be able to give them constructive, relevant advice and bring it back to a data protection and privacy related issue, which it will do very much to. Just have a look. So have a think. Some of the comments and things that we've posted in here, just let me know your thoughts. So comment down below. If you want to get in touch, feel free to. As I say, this is very much my reflections based on working on a number of projects and working with different people. So let me know your thoughts. Greatly appreciated. Well, that's everything for this week. If you do have any thoughts, comments, let me know. Otherwise, looking forward to the next episode where we'll be looking at imposter syndrome and how that works, and how imposter syndrome is a big problem in our profession. It is. We all suffer from it in some form or another. I especially, which is why I think we should be talking about it more in order to combat it. Like, subscribe, pass on, share to others, or give me any feedback. Or do both. Either way, I'll see you next time.